In 1896, they decided they wanted to do something to make gliding a safe sport. And they felt like they knew what the problems were. You see, most people that took up that sport back then were injured and a lot were killed. And that's what they wanted to stop. And the problem, they said, was absolutely no control. You see, the wings people used were rigid or fixed. They couldn't move them at all. So once their feet left the ground, they had no control. So the Wright Brothers started reading and studying everything they could find about flight. People had been writing about it for 200 years. They even wrote to the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., asking for a list of all publications on aeronautics. Now, they learned all about lift tables and wing shapes and those things. And during this time of study, the Wright brothers were working 6 days a week at their bicycle shop. But on Sundays, they would never work. So on Sunday afternoon, they would build kites in different shapes and sizes, go out into the fields around Dayton to fly these kites, see how they would react in the wind. But some Sunday afternoon, they would simply lay out in the fields and watch the birds. What they really liked to watch, though, was the big soaring birds, the buzzards and the eagles, and how they could fly for long periods of time without flapping those wings, or gently bending their wing tips to keep their balance in the air currents. And they said, that's what we need. We need to build a wing that we can control wing tips on. Now they knew they couldn't duplicate a bird, but they would bring to something. 1899, they built a very large box kite, put hinges on it so they could actually flex these wings back and forth. Had 4 strings coming out of it, not just one. They learned to get this thing in the air, pull the different strings, and eventually they could cause this kite to do what they wanted it to do. And eventually they began to believe they knew what they were doing. They decided that in 1900, they were going to take a vacation. They were going somewhere they'd never been. They wanted to camp out, and they wanted to learn how to fly. They write the Weather Bureau in Washington, D.C. Give us a list of places in the United States where these conditions exist. Winds that average over 16 miles an hour. Wide open spaces, no boulders, rocks, or trees, no obstructions to run into. Hills to glide off of, soft sand to land in. Well, they received a long list of places, and they heard of every place on that list was one. Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. Now they wrote to several other places, and they just wrote to Kitty Hawk to find out about it since they'd never heard of it. But J.J. Dozier, the weatherman in Kitty Hawk, was the first one to respond to it. Of course, he probably hadn't had a letter down here for a month or so anyway, so he wrote right back. But he also went over and talked to Bill Tate, the postmaster. Now, Bill Tate's also a county commissioner. He decided he would correspond with the Wright brothers. And when he wrote to them, basically all he said in that first letter was this: y'all just come on down here because we got everything you need. The same thing they tell you today. And then when you first get here, the good folks will help you set up a camp or anything else you might want. And by the way, when you first get here, you just stay at my house. We can feed you, you can sleep there, and we will not charge you anything. Now folks, I don't know how long you've been coming to the Outer Banks, but I doubt very many of you got that deal. Quit the next day. Anyway, Wilbur came by himself just to look it over. But as soon as he got here and met the folks and saw this area, he knew it was what they needed. He wires Orville to come on down. Now that first year, what they brought down here, we would call it huge kite, small glider, 16-foot wingspan. All of the testing that year, with the exception of one day, was done right up by the village of Kitty Hawk, 3.5 miles north. Now up there, they used it as a kite. And they would put weights on it to simulate the weight of a person, get it into the air and control it with ropes. Well, after doing that for a while, just like that kite back in Ohio, again, they began to think they knew what they were doing. So they decided it was time to do a campman gliding. They brought it over here to this big hill one day. Wilbur was the only one to get on it. And for a total of 10 minutes, they attempted to glide. And after only 10 minutes, they said, whoa, this thing is dangerous. It's unsafe, it's unstable. Somebody's getting ready to get hurt here. You know, we've made the effort. Maybe we better pack up and go home while we still can. And that's what they did. They packed up and headed home, not knowing what they would do later, if they'd ever come back. But as they went home on the train and discussed what had taken place, he actually came up with 2 things. Number 1 was, we sure didn't learn how to fly. But number 2 is, if we quit this easy, we'll never accomplish anything. We're not going to give up or try one more time. So that winter they read and they study more. They redesigned the glider some. 22-foot wingspan. Came back down here in 1901, they set up camp right out here by the hills. And for 6 weeks attempted glides off these hills. Sometimes going over 300 feet, further than most people ever dreamed of. But what they understood about it was this: it wasn't because they wanted to, it was simply because the wind wanted them to. They were hanging on for dear life. So after only 6 weeks, again, they stopped. This thing's dangerous, unsafe, unstable, somebody's going to get hurt. We've tried twice now. We better get on back home while we still can and work on our bicycles. So again, they pack up and leave, not knowing what to do next. But as he went home on the train, discussed what had taken place, came up with two things again. Number one was, you know something? What we're doing just don't work. What were they doing? The same thing the other people were doing. The same lift tables, the same wing shapes, only difference was they could twist in wing tips a little bit. Now that hadn't worked for the other people, why should it work for them? Second thing he came up with back here was, you know, if we quit this easy, we'll never accomplish anything. We're not going to give up. We'll try one more time. Now what they did in the winter of 1901 changed the history of the world. They got home, they built their own little wind tunnel. Now they didn't invent wind tunnels, but they studied them, researched them, and read about them like everything else they did, and then they built their own. They tested 200 different airfoils and wing shapes. They refigured all those lift tables they've been using. They came back down here in 1902. They had a glider that looks like the one in the rear of the building here, with one exception. It had a stabilizer that was fixed in on the back. It did not move. I tend to wake the children up so they'll move. It did not move. But that wing, 32-foot wingspan, the largest thing anyone had ever tried before. But the shape of the wing was different. The hump or camber in the wing the first 2 years was basically down the center. They moved it forward between the fourth and the third and the front. Then they take it back off on like a bird's wing. It's done the same thickness all the way through. And when they started jumping off these hills in 1902, almost instant success. They could go forward. They could make it go up and down. They could roll it just a little bit to keep their balance in the air. But anytime they tried to roll it real hard so it would turn, it would just go right down to the ground. No matter which way they tried to go, to the ground it would go. They couldn't figure out how to get the thing to turn. They decided they would go home and use a wind tunnel for that. But one morning before they left, Wilbur wakes up, looks down at the table, and there sits Orville, all dressed up, drinking coffee. Said he slept 2 hours that night, been up the rest of the night drinking coffee and trying to figure out how to get this thing to turn. And this is what he came up with.